Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hen Wang, co-director of the Tsinghua-UNSW Joint Research Centre for International Commercial and Economic Law. I'm also the co-director of the UNSW Law's Herbert Smith Freehills China International Business and Economic Law Center, CIBO. Today, I am delighted to welcome you to the final session of the inaugural conference of the Tsinghua-UNSW Joint Research Centre for International Commercial and Economic Law, the JCICEL. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we met today. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. And today we are very fortunate to have three speakers, Dr. Weihuan Zhou, Mr. Simon Lacy, and Dr. Lu Wang. And also we are very fortunate to have Professor Weizhuo Chen of Tsinghua University to be the commentator. And we'll further introduce them before they speak. And we will discuss today is about trade and investment, which is being a very important issue in the current dynamics. And we'll look at different aspects of the impact of technology competition, or the issue of the technology decoupling, and the issue regarding the China-EU investment treaty negotiation, including the FDI screening. And we're very thankful to all of them to make the time to join us today. And also thank you all for being with us today as well. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Weihuan Zhou, the member of the Herbert Smith Freehills Civil Center at UNSW Law. Dr. Weihuan Zhou is a senior lecturer at UNSW Law. He published widely in the field of international economic law, particularly the law of the WTO, trade remedies, free trade agreements, and China. His work has appeared in most of the top journals in this field and has been widely cited, including research reports for the European Parliament, EU Parliament briefings, Australia's Productivity Commission report of the Parliament of Australia, and also by leading experts and commentators. Weihuan is a regular invitee to speak at internationally renowned conferences, review book proposals, and manuscripts for prestigious academic publishers, providing training for government officials and comments on contemporary international economic law matters, such as interview at ABC News, appearing pieces in the conversation. Without further ado, Weihuan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hen, for the kind introduction. So my topic today is really trying to align with the theme of this conference. I'll be talking about technology competition, which is happening in the domestic market and international market, but with the focus on the issue of subsidies in industry policies. I guess to really align with the theme of the conference, it is always best to start by recognizing that we are actually in the industry revolution phase that is underpinned by technology and innovation-driven digital transformation and economic development. To build technological and innovative capacity and global competitiveness, major economies have been relying on industry policies and all sorts of policy instruments. Subsidies, which have been widely used for a variety of regulatory goals, have also played a critical role in promoting technological advancement and innovation. First, with the current pandemic, industry policies and subsidies are certainly becoming more crucial to economic recovery and welfare of all nations. Their economic and political implications, however, should not be underestimated. The pandemic has had significant impacts on all economies and will likely have enduring impacts. However, I think this really what I want to focus on is that we also need to pay attention to the enduring impacts that the subsidies or all of the industry policy instruments that governments are currently using to deal with the pandemic. So what I'm going to do today in the following 15 minutes is really, sorry, can we go back to the previous slides? Is really talk about the context a little bit more about technology competition and the subsidies. And then with the focus on the China's technology policies and subsidies. And I will talk about the international regulation of subsidies in the context of China's technology subsidies and policies, trying to make an argument about whether the existing international regulation of subsidies are sufficient to deal with China's policies and subsidies. And finally, I will draw attention to some of the suggestions about how we best go forward in dealing with COVID-19, in dealing with international cooperation on trade policies, and particularly subsidies. Next slide, please. So the pandemic has intensified the trends of deglobalization due to the growth and expansion of economic and potential political tensions, and the rise of economic nationalism, and consequently the resort to beggar for labor and tit-for-tat policies, and the shift from international cooperation to unilateralism. The most significant example has been the US-China trade war, as we are all aware of, which is escalating into a broader economic decoupling with technological decoupling in its core, as Simon will talk about later on. Despite the complexities and uncertainties, efforts to reform world trade rules have continued. However, many major recent proposals have focused on the lack of rules or lack of effectiveness of the existing rules in dealing with China. In a previous article, we have tried to argue that how the existing rules may actually be used to deal with the issue of state-owned enterprises. I think in this particular presentation, the article coming out of it, the existing rules are also sufficient to deal with China's subsidies in the technology sector. Therefore, we argue that any inadequacies in the existing rules, the subsidy rules of the WTO, are not China-specific, but apply to all WTO members. This means that the reforms must not just focus on China, but need to be based on a broader compromise and consensus, taking into account the interests and needs of all WTO members. Next slide, please. In the following two slides, I'm just trying to show you some data and then again from a very timely report on the rising of protectionism and also the use of subsidies in the next slide. So you can say that the rising use of subsidies, even the prohibited type of subsidies or the actionable types of subsidies, have all been on the rise in the past few years. And obviously, the data in 2020, given the pandemic and also all of the actions taken by governments in dealing with it, will show you a more kind of upward trend in the use of different types of protectionist measures, including industry policies and subsidies. Next slide, please. So with that context, I think that shows where we are, and the specific topic about the Chinese subsidies is my next topic. Given the audience, I wouldn't really spend too much time on really articulating the different types of subsidies and industry policies, including the evolution of China's technology policies in the past decades. It have been quite significant and detailed. On this slide, I basically give you a summary of the key policy documents, including the latest developments in the field about the establishment of new infrastructure, enabling infrastructure for technology, and also what we call the dual circulation, which just came out as the next step of economic policies in China. And also draw your attention to the specific types in the broader categories, right? In the technological in the technology sectors in China, we have seen the development of policies leading to the use of different types of subsidies, including direct transfer of funds, including giving money directly or providing loans, all sorts of these kinds of subsidies, but also tax benefits, preferable purchase of goods and services, but including also providing goods and services, and those forms of subsidies in various types we found in the past decades, including now, are quite significant and expensive, right? But we didn't really find many examples of price and income support, and that might be just a result from China's commitment at the WTO as documented in its accession instruments. In the middle column, if you like, on the slides, is really sets out some of the broader objectives or strategic goals that China tries to achieve, which were actually documented in the policy documents and reflected and supported by the subsidies. So with that, I will just continue to discuss the question of whether the WTO rules are actually sufficient to deal with these subsidies. Before I do that, I do want to raise a very broad point and fundamental level. I think when we consider whether China's industry policies and subsidies should be dealt with, we need to discuss it in light of the global context and historical context, if you like. And this context begins with the fact that all governments have preferred industry policies and priority sectors. And all governments adopt a variety of supportive policy instruments, including subsidies. And subsidization has become natural in all economies, developed and developing alike. The global technology leaders today, such as the US, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and the emerging ones, such as India, have all relied heavily on such policies to develop technological capabilities, and in many cases, to create national champions in priority sectors. So China is not unique in that sense. This means that, again, if we are trying to effectively discipline international industry policies and subsidies at the international level, targeting China is neither the solution nor a feasible solution. All governments will need policy space to use subsidies, so the Chinese government. The question then is how to strike a balance between regulating the trade effects of subsidies and leaving sufficient room for the use of subsidies for legitimate regulatory goals. Next slide, please. So the efficacy of existing WTO rules on subsidies must be considered in that context. The rules reflect a delicate compromise among negotiators, particularly back in the Uruguay round negotiations, that was largely attempted to achieve the balance I just talked about. That compromise or balance must inform the application and interpretation of the subsidy rules. Another point to make here is that the efficacy of the existing rules must be assessed based on a detailed analysis of the rules itself. We must not make or accept unfounded allegations about the inadequacy of the rules in general or lack of effect on economies like China. In fact, most of the critics currently we have seen have not really digged into the detailed legal elements of the existing rules, have not really considered China's specific WTO obligations. So if you take these things together and run a really detailed analysis based on the existing jurisprudence, the argument from our point of view is that these rules are not necessarily inefficient, at least not inefficient in dealing with China's subsidies in the high-tech sector. So these are the elements I'm just trying to highlight there. Again, given the time, I wouldn't really go into each of the elements. Each of them may actually around 10 pages to write about. I would just highlight or use public body as an example. The question is really about if a subsidy is not provided directly by a government, whether a government entity or entity that is related to government should be treated as a public body. So that is actually within the definition of subsidy rules that could actually be entitled to provide a subsidy. The extreme view is that all state-owned enterprises, because of the ownership, should be treated as a public body. So everything they provide could be, at least in principle, be treated as a subsidy. The other extreme view is to say that you have to establish in every case that a specific conduct of any entity is attributable to a government. All right. Both of the views have already been rejected by the WTO tribunals. The WTO tribunals or the jurisprudence sets out the position that it needs to be a function or authority-based approach to determining whether a public body exists. So that is basically whether this particular entity has actually exercised government functions. So again, I think that balance provides sufficient room for one to establish that a particular entity is a public body in the high-tech subsidy sector. Next slide, please. So given the time, I won't really go through all of the elements, but I think what I will say here is just turn to, if the conclusion is that the rules are not really inadequate in dealing with China specifically, then the question is how we're going to move forward if we want to reform the rules. Accepting that the rules have loopholes and needs to be improved, and how we do it. I guess first thing that we need to recognize is that most of the issues in the current trade tensions globally and also bilaterally between the US and China have already existed for a long time. So these issues relating to China's economic model, industry policies, have been a major concern, at least since China's negotiations of accession to the WTO. So solutions to the pandemic may not be sufficient responses to these issues, although the pandemic may provide an opportunity to regain the momentum for international cooperation. And secondly, I would basically make a final point, is that put aside the pros and cons of the recent proposals and suggestions, as you can see, I have listed in the slide. The larger point is that to the extent these suggestions are predominantly, if not exclusively, targeted at China, they're unlikely to be valid or feasible solutions for how to improve subsidy rules through collective actions. Like all past rounds of multilateral negotiations, the rulemaking must be based on collective efforts and will necessarily end up with a compromise among major players. So the fundamental question is how to achieve a balance between trade regulation and domestic regulatory autonomy. And this balance must be based on consideration of interests and needs of all countries involved. Like the inaugural round negotiations, the end result might not be ideal, but at least it is a result of international cooperation, reflecting the desirable political balance at this particular time and in this particular environment. To the extent it brings countries to back to the collaborative track, we will be moving against unilateralism and protectionism, which have been proven to be mutually destructive and non-sustainable. Next slide, please. Sorry, I would just finish there, and I provide some of the most recent readings for you to follow up if you like, and I'm happy to engage in the discussions.
Thank you, Weihuan, for the very timely and fantastic talk about the very timely issue how do we deal with the potential competition related, and also the subsidizing of the technology developments. I think it makes a lot of sense these days for us to think of what are the potential pathways we will face in the future. And we look forward to more discussion in the Q&A session.